Hey guys, this is Dr. David Pizzino, and I'd like to welcome you to Medical Anthropology. In this first lecture here, I'll be delivering an introduction to medical anthropology and the discipline of medical anthropology as a whole. The things that we're going to be covering over the course of this lecture is first we're going to define medical anthropology. We're then going to look into the various issues of study, or what it is that medical anthropologists do and all of the diversity. We'll look at some of the history of medical anthropology, how it developed within the field of anthropology and distinguished itself, and also how it's a key player right now in anthropology as a whole. From there, we'll transition into various approaches in medical anthropology, including theoretical contexts, and then we'll look at medical anthropology in the context of broader academic work and research, as well as applied work. And we'll see clearly with medical anthropology the promise of anthropology as a whole to be an applied science. The authors of your textbook, Merrill Singer and Hans Baer, in 2012, Introducing Medical Anthropology, Discipline and Action, note that medical anthropologists are engaged in using and expanding many of anthropology's key concepts in an effort to understand what sickness is, how it is understood and directly experienced and acted on by sufferers, their social networks, and healers, and how health-related benefits and practices fit within and are shaped by encompassing social and cultural systems and social and environmental context. So to me, this is a lot to get your head around. This is a lot to think about. And we'll pause with a question here. What can medical anthropology actually provide that is missing in biological approaches to the body as a whole? So go ahead and pause the recording for a minute or two and think about what exactly is entailed there. So looking at medical anthropology and further defining it and situating it, it's a subfield within anthropology. Indeed, it bridges many of the different major subfields of anthropology. Is it applied or theoretical? Is there a real tension that exists here? And I believe that as you go through the class and you look at the textbook as well as the various journal articles and ethnographies that we'll be considering, that the question of whether it's applied versus theoretical is a moot one, really, truly, because you see theoretical work that's actually built into an applied context as well. It draws on cultural, biological anthropology, archaeology, as well as linguistic anthropology. Its focus as a whole is to better understand those factors which influence health and well-being, broadly defined, including cultural conceptions of health and well-being. Indeed, this is what's referred to as a bioculturalist approach. So we have this phenomenon of pain, and pain is very subjective. If you go into the doctor, a medical doctor in the biomedical setting, the doctor might ask you things like, what's your pain level on a scale from 1 to 10? Well, one person's 3 might be another person's 9. Along these lines, Hans Baer and Merrill Singer in their text talk about the differences between childbirth in the United States and Poland as far as the use of painkillers and looking at how much pain is actually looked at. So one of the key foci here is the idea of social connections as well as human biology as a whole. The experience and distribution of illness, the prevention and treatment of sickness, healing processes, and the social relations of therapy management, as well as the cultural importance and utilization of pluralistic medical systems, which we'll be getting into later in terms of how individuals navigate various medical systems in cultural contexts. So some of the issues of study include health ramifications of ecological adaptation and maladaptation, popular health culture and domestic healthcare practices, local interpretations of bodily processes. Again, here's the idea of the physical differences in terms of what's physiologically happening, and then the local interpretations of what that is. Changing body projects and valued bodily attributes. Things like body image, looking at what the ideal body is, how that's constituted, performance as a whole, how does one value and think about themselves, how does one embody these experiences of the self. Perceptions of risk, vulnerability, and responsibility for illness, as well as healthcare and the various narratives that go along with that. Risk and protective dimensions of human behavior, including cultural norms and social institutions. Preventative health and harm reduction practices. the experience of illness and the social relations of sickness. And again, I mean, this is a theme that's underlying medical anthropology as a whole, with a cultural construction of disease. The range of factors driving health, nutrition, and healthcare transitions from an epidemiological perspective, ethnomedicine, pluralistic healing modalities and healing processes. And again, we'll focus on this in the context of this class and in the context of our discussions on medical pluralism. The social organization of clinical interactions. So what actually happens in clinical encounters? How do doctors interact with one another? How do they interact with patients, with other staff, with nurses, for the delivery of healthcare? And then who actually has control in the context of those medical encounters? And this is some of the work of Wilson, his work on medical discourse as a whole. The cultural and historical conditions shaping medical practices as well as policies. Here we get into discussions of political economy, looking more in the context of critical medical anthropology. Medical context in the context of modernity, colonial and post-colonial social formations. Again, situating these practices historically so that they don't exist in perpetuity for all time, not these naturalizing discourses. The use and interpretation of pharmaceuticals and forms of biotechnology, the commercialization and commodification of health and medicine. So we get here into questions about bioethics, about distribution, and not only the commodification of health and medicine, but the body as a whole. We'll see this with some of the work being done on living cadavers in the context of the Bangladeshi Indian trade in organs, the organ trade as a whole. Disease distribution and health disparity. Again, this is key in the context of critical medical anthropology, which really looks at these broader systematic factors rather than looking at health and wellness as an isolated phenomena, health, disease, illness in isolated phenomena. The differential use and availability of government and private healthcare resources, including the proliferation of NGOs, the retreat of the state with structural adjustment programs and policies, whereby welfare programs, healthcare programs are cut, and individuals are left to seek health care in various institutional settings, be they non-government organizations, including religious organizations, or usually we see this in the context of smaller clinics. The political ecology of infectious and vector-borne diseases, chronic diseases and states of malnutrition and violence. And again, these are a lot of these are discussed in the context of structural violence, which we'll be discussing in the context of this class as a whole. The possibility for a critically engaged yet clinically relevant application of anthropology in the context of medicine, health, and healing overall. So the origins of medical anthropology include both the work of physical anthropologists and cultural anthropologists. Physical anthropologists have always been interested in health and disease. They seek to identify the cause of death. We see this with things like this popularization of this in CSI, crime scene investigation, and these sorts of things, and to assess the health of ancient societies as well. So you see the work, the crossing over of both physical anthropologists and archaeologists in this context. Cultural anthropologists, they were initially interested in medicine in passing chapters on magic or religion. And indeed, the sharp dividing line between these is rather arbitrary, as we'll see in the context of our discussions concerning faith and healing, and in both religious and non-religious contexts. So the early work in anthropology, and again, much of this comes from individuals who are coming from outside the discipline as well as within the discipline. And this is one, of course, I believe one of the great attributes of anthropology as a whole, where we bring in multiple disciplines, the holistic perspective, where we bring in everything possible when considering a particular issue. So W.H.R. Rivers, who lived from 1864 to 1922, did work in an expedition in the Torres Straits, which is north of Australia. You can see the map there at the bottom right. One of his major publications was out in 1927, entitled Medicine, Magic, and Religion. In this, he details that diseases are believed to be caused by human agency, that is magical, spiritual or supernatural agency, or taboo, and or natural agency. There's these different descriptions of why diseases are caused. The focus is on human agency, and W.H.R. Rivers notes that the practice of medicine is a social process which is subject to the same laws and to be studied by the same methods as other social processes. And so we can also see the application here to other aspects of anthropology, including things like anthropology of religion, and in that even very idiosyncratic, very individual types of endeavors are in fact social. They're culturally constructed, and hence they can be analyzed in a cultural anthropology context. He insisted that healing practices of so-called quote-unquote primitive people are logical and systematic, in some respects more rational than our own. That is, that they are internally coherent structures of cultural beliefs about the causes of diseases. And so mirroring the work of Franz Boas in early calls for cultural relativism in American anthropology as a whole. That is, that you have particular ways of approaching the world, in this case, issues of illness and disease and healing, and how individuals come to confront that in a meaningful way in their own disparate cultural contexts. He separated indigenous healing from biomedicine. He believed that indigenous healing was marked by spells and rituals, whereas biomedicine was marked by natural laws and scientific principles. And in the discussion by Singer and Baer in their text, they talk very explicitly about how in cultural anthropology today, there's not necessarily the sharp differentiation between indigenous healing and biomedicine. That biomedicine is in fact a type of ethnomedicine. And again, we'll be discussing this further as we go along in the class. Ackernecht's early work in anthropological contributions to anthropology, he wrote essays in the 1940s and 50s attributing disease to witchcraft performed by political enemies. Healing behaviors and ideas tend to reflect the wider cultural traditions of the society in which they develop. And this was essentially supporting the status quo against those who are inclined to deviate from the social norms as a whole. So he looked at the sort of functionalist perspective of medicine as a whole here in healing and any sort of divergences from health. Ackernecht notes that what is disease is in the last instance not biological fact, but a decision of society. So what comes to be considered an ideal body or a healthy body versus the diseased body is one that a decision that's not necessarily made at the individual level. And we'll get more into discussions of divergences between illness and disease as we progress. Anthropologists were very much in the applied context, beginning with consulting in the 1950s. This was the final catalyst for anthropological research specifically focused on health and disease, and really laid the bedrock for the formation of medical anthropology as a unique discipline in anthropology, as a unique focus for anthropologists as a whole. Du Bois was hired by the World Health Organization in 1950. She had done numerous work with the World Health Organization. You have Adams in 1955 looking at village resistance in Guatemala to child nutrition programs supported by the World Health Organization and the Institute of Nutrition of Central America and Panama. What was going on there is that these organizations were essentially taking children's blood, and the individuals were looking at this at the community level, at the village level in Guatemala, as negatively impacting health. The samples were seen as a permanent loss of strength, and this helped to, well, this was tied into earlier ideologies or mythologies of colonialism, where they were essentially fattening up the children to eat them. The whites would essentially fatten up the Indians in order to eat them. Caudhell's 1953 work, the notion of applied anthropology and medicine, this is where you start to see discussion of medical anthropology in the discipline. This is an academic article that comes out in 1953. It predates the term medical anthropology and discusses anthropological involvement in two different settings. First, international health development work, and second, in medical schools as well as clinical settings. Paul's work in 1955, where he published a series of case studies and applied work in international and domestic health projects.